Well, Press Freedom Day comes up on the 3rd of May every year. This year is the 30th installment of the UNESCO Design Day, and it is focused on shaping a future of rights, freedom of expression as a driver for all other human rights. In our focus on the nation's capital, we look at the challenges faced by journalists in Nigeria, challenges that negate our right to free expression. My guest is a world-renowned journalist with a resume I envy and hope to outshine one day. He knows firsthand what media gags can do to society, so he takes us global in this discourse. How can governments support and promote press freedom? We also have for you an update on major stories from Nigeria's seat of power. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Dateline Abuja. Hello and welcome to Dateline Abuja. I am Kayla Megwa. Let's begin with a roundup of the major stories from Nigeria's presidency.
President Muhammadu Buhari has launched the Nigeria Agenda 2050, aimed at increasing real gross domestic product growth by 7% and create 165 million new jobs across the country. The launch, which comes nearly 7 weeks after the Federal Executive Council approved the policy document on March the 15th, was conducted by the President before the commencement of the weekly council meeting. He expressed the belief that the document, which equally aims to increase per capita income of Nigeria to $33,328 per annum to be placed amongst the world's top economies by 2050, will be useful for subsequent administrations.
Reading and public presentation of the Nigerian Agenda 2050 marks yet another milestone in the annals of history of our planning experience post-independence. The broad target is to ensure that Nigeria attains a per capita GDP of $33,328 United States dollars per annum that will place her among the top middle-income economies in the world by 2050.
President Muhammadu Buhari has departed for London, United Kingdom, to join other world leaders invited to attend the coronation of Charles III and his wife Camilla as His Majesty the King and Her Majesty the Queen Consort of the United Kingdom, respectively. Ahead of the coronation on Saturday, May the 6th, the Commonwealth Secretariat is expected to host a Commonwealth Summit for presidents and heads of government of Commonwealth countries on Friday, May the 5th. According to a statement issued by the spokesperson to the President, Mr. Femi Adesina, President Buhari is billed to participate in the summit, which will deliberate on the future of the Commonwealth and the role of the youth. Governor David Umahi of Ebonyi State has pleaded with the All Progressives Congress to prioritize consideration for the Southeast in the choice of the Senate presidency for the sake of equity, urging that inadequate votes from the Southeast should not be a deterrent. Governor Umahi made the plea today when he met with the president privately at the State House. He urged that the party show understanding, underscoring that he fought for the APC in spite of criticism, even at the peak of the NSARS, because of his conviction that it is the turn of the presidency to be zoned to the south.
I think at this stage, of course, led by our father and the president, is to talk about how do we unite the country. And let me also emphasize that, yes, the Northwest, they have a right. They voted massively, Nobody is asking them to waive their rights, but we can plead with them and say for a situation like this, the Northwest governors and of course the Northern governors, they have a very big stake in this governance.
A first and second batch of Nigerians have been successfully evacuated back to Nigeria from Sudan through the Aswan airport in Egypt. A total of 500 Nigerian nationals, majorly students, were airlifted by the Air Force C-130, provided by the Nigerian Air Force. An Air Peace flight from Egypt and Taco Airline aircraft arrived at Nnamdi Azikiwe International Airport during the week. And a judge at the Central Criminal Court, also known as the Old Bailey, has sentenced former Deputy Senate President Ike Ekweremadu, his wife Beatrice, and Dr. Obinna Obeta to jail. At a sentencing hearing on Friday, Ekweremadu was jailed for 9 years and 8 months. His wife Beatrice was sentenced to 4 years and 6 months, while Obeta received a 10-year prison term. The sentencing follows their conviction in March for organ trafficking. Their ill daughter Sonia, who the organs were being harvested for, was cleared of any wrongdoing. And former head of state General Yakubu Gowon is urging Nigerians to accept the decisions of the Election Petition Tribunal. He stated this at a symposium in honor of former Justice of the Supreme Court, late Justice Chike Edigwe, held in Abuja. General Gowon adds that only an impartial and independent judiciary can ensure the protection of the country's democracy.
As we move forward as a nation, let us not forget the role that the judiciary plays in nation building, especially the apex court, in its carrying out its duty of questioning the veracity of the decisions of the lower courts. As such, we need to allow the apex court their deliberations and come up with their decisions.
Nigeria's humanitarian ministry is describing the $1.8 million World Food Project as a success, explaining that apart from impacting the lives of 13,000 Nigerians in the areas worst hit by the flood in 2020, the project has built resilience to flood disasters in those areas. Speaking in Abuja at the closeout ceremony of the project, which was in progress from 1st October 2019 till 30th November 2022, the Permanent Secretary of Nigeria's Humanitarian Ministry, Mr. Nasir Sani Gwarzo, thanked the partners for keeping to their contribution promises and says recipients of the aid now have a chance of a better life.
The projects were successfully implemented and they touched many lives in the Northeast and the Northwest and the entire country at large. Specifically, the humanitarian assistance for the flood victims, with the objective of providing in-kind assistance of food and non-food items, shelter kits to households, water sanitation was implemented across the 16 flood most affected states.
The House of Representatives has approved the 23.72 trillion naira Ways and Means request of the President. This is coming 24 hours after the request was approved by the Senate. Meanwhile, the House is asking the Independent National Electoral Commission to develop a system to delete dead voters from the voters' register, as well as voters who do not vote in 2 election cycles.
Quite an eventful week in the nation's capital. Welcome back, and now let's get down to business. World Press Freedom Day was commemorated during the week, and it filled many of us with disappointment. The knowledge that 30 years after, we're still demanding freedom of expression for journalists, and the same daunting challenges faced by journalists 30 years ago are still present today, especially in Nigeria, maybe even worse. Despite our independence, our return to democracy, and several legislations in place to ensure this freedom. Our next report examines the challenges to freedom of the press and what can be done about them. May the 3rd every year is World Press Freedom Day, a day set aside by the United Nations towards achieving a free press and freedom of expression around the world. 2023 is the 30th year of celebrating World Press Freedom Day. And this year, the focus is on shaping a future of rights, freedom of expression as a driver for all other human rights. The indices that led to these same demands 30 years ago are still in play today. So we went to the FCT chapter of the Nigerian Union of Journalists and hear from journalists themselves what is stifling their freedom of expression.
The world have not understand generally the work of the press or the media. They look at us as people that are spying people or in different connotation. Actually, press or media personnel, they are friends. They have human interests at heart. They are there for the masses. Do you know why? Because of their function.
The reverence we had is being eroded because even fake news emanate from even the journalists themselves. So it's a big problem. But that is still not enough reason for any press to be gagged, because when you distort free information, you are leaving a space for those who don't have information to thrive.
Another gag on Nigeria's journalists come from actual regulations in Nigeria's laws. On the sidelines of this World Press Freedom Day event, we spoke to the chairperson of the Nigerian Union of Journalists, FCT chapter, on what laws are anti-freedom of expression and what solutions can be proffered.
The broadcast industry, in particular, is hamstrung by the NBC Code, and that is why we'll be talking about co-regulation, that before there is sanction, there should be a board that is made up of both government and media owners and media practitioners to look at what the infractions are, if there are any. You understand the idea that the NBC sits and it's operating a code that has been controversial. That code, you remember, that was passed in Lagos, drew so much controversy, and the board at that time even rejected the code that the NBC is using. You understand? So we want a situation where we can all sit down and look at the existing laws. For the print media, why should defamation be a criminal matter? If I defame you, it should be a civil matter where you should go to court and seek for redress, and not for the commissioner of police acting as the prosecutor in this matter. I didn't defame the government. I didn't defame, even if it were an institution. It should be a civil matter where you should go and, make the argument and not criminalize me for whatever news reporting.
Freedom of expression by the press has improved greatly in Nigeria since independence, and even better since the country's return to democracy in 1999. However, the safety of journalists are still largely ignored in many parts of Nigeria. And fear of retribution for speaking the truth has made many journalists shy away from topics deemed controversial. In 2022 alone, 67 journalists were killed in the line of duty across the world. One of the more recent shocking stories of violence against journalists involves a 48-year-old Indian journalist called Shashikant Warishe, who was mowed down in February this year by a car driven by a person Warishe had written an article against. In Nigeria, at least 19 journalists have been killed in questionable circumstances since the country's return to democracy in 1999. They include Zachariah Issa of NTA, Bayo Ohu of The Guardian, Titus Badejo of Niger FM, Todwe Salem of The Vanguard, and Enenche Akogu and Precious Owolabi, both of Channels Television, just to name a few. Apart from insecurity, Nigerian journalists have a plethora of challenges facing them in this country.
Journalists in Nigeria are poorly remunerated. They are not just poorly remunerated, they are also epileptically remunerated. Where what you get at the end of the day is not commensurate with what you put in, it's a disservice to you. And you also have a situation where journalists work for several months and they are not paid. That in itself is a major challenge that we have in the industry. Then we have the issue around legal framework. We have an array of laws that tend to undermine press freedom. Remember, on a day like this, is an opportunity for us to remind government of its obligations to ensuring that there is press freedom in their system. Now you have an array of laws which tend to undermine same. That's not a good one. You have the Cybercrime Act prohibition of 2015. You have criminal code, you have a penal code, they are all there. You have laws on libel. All these laws substantially undermine press freedom.
In every war, the very first casualty is truth. And make no mistake about it, Nigeria is at war. A war against corruption, a war against insurgency, a war against poverty. So many wars fought on many different fronts. Journalists are charged with the responsibility of preserving truth amid orchestrated misinformation and propaganda, while dealing with poor remuneration, poor funding for investigative stories, poor access to information, and government gags on expression. For the growth, development, and success of any society, governments must protect the right to freedom of expression of the fourth estate of the realm. Joining me to discuss press freedom in the era of fake news, poverty, and media gags by governments across the world is a world-renowned former BBC journalist who specialized in the changing nature of journalism, Mr. David Hayward. He is known these days as a digital news consultant and journalist, but his journalism background is one very few journalists achieve in their lifetime. During his distinguished career in the BBC, he worked as a reporter, producer, and senior editor on network radio, television, and for the BBC World Service Trust. He was the editor of the first BBC newsroom to be staffed entirely by video journalists. He set up and ran the groundbreaking BBC local TV pilot and led projects to re-establish a free and fair media in Eastern Europe during the late 1990s. During that time, he worked extensively in Romania, Bosnia, and Albania. Please watch this. Mr. David Hayward, welcome to Dateline Abuja.
It's a pleasure to be with you. It's a pleasure to be on Dateline Abuja.
So let's talk about it. World Press Freedom Day 2023.
Yeah.
It's all about the freedom of expression. I did feel a little disappointed that the theme for this year is very similar to the theme that we had 30 years ago. This is the 30th installment. And 30 years ago, we're still asking for freedom of expression for the press and access to information. 30 years down the line, we're still saying the exact same thing. Now, you've been very involved in the evolution of media and, modern journalism and how governments can adapt to modern journalism and make it better and more, more in tandem with the times and, ensuring that the journalists around the world are able to express themselves regardless of the times we find ourselves in. Let's talk a bit about the theme for this year. What do you make of it and what's gone wrong? Why is it that 30 years down the line, we still have the same question?
Nothing would please me more than to have no more World Press Freedom Days. Wouldn't it be great if 30 years ago and we began to address and we began to look at and we began to really take notice of the types of issues and the types of questions which journalists had? But unfortunately, governments don't, and governments all over the world don't. And as journalists, we face exactly the same, if not worse, issues now, 30 years after the first World Press Freedom Day, than we did then. We've got new challenges, we've got new forms of misinformation, there are new aggressive ways in which governments all over the world are attacking journalists and attacking freedom of expression. And so I think this year, almost above any other year, it's as important. We look at what's happening in Ukraine, you look at what's happening in Russia, you look at what's happening all over the world. Journalists are being targeted, journalists are being attacked, and journalists are being stopped from doing what they absolutely need to be doing, which is finding information out and exposing wrongdoing. I think there are a number of things that can be done, a number of things that can be done from an international level, a number of things that can be done from NGOs' perspective, a number of things. The very fact that the United Nations supports and manages the World Press Freedom Day sends a very important message. But I think it's got to go further than that. I think there's got to be legal sanctions. There's got to be some sort of sanction that stops people attacking journalists, that stops people gagging journalists. As you say, 67 journalists or media workers were killed last year. It's one of the highest levels for the past few years. It's really, really damaging. It's very, very distressing. What can governments do about it? Governments can come out and support press freedom. Governments can come out and support media freedom. You're absolutely right. The point that you make about a democracy, a free democracy, having a free press, a free media is absolutely essential. The two go hand in hand. Without a free media, I don't think you can have a free democracy. And I think that's absolutely essential. But to get them to see that is a big gap.
Of course, everyone is facing fake news around the world. That is one of the major gags to freedom because you are contesting against coordinated misinformation. It's a very scary world we live in right now. And then there's also the fact that a lot of journalists do not get enough remuneration. Many journalists are impoverished, so it's easy to buy them and to buy their stories. These are just, and then of course there's a security question. These are some of the issues that we're facing here in Nigeria, and I'm sure a lot of journalists are facing the same thing around the world. In fact, maybe even facing worse. How do we navigate journalism in today's world?
Here's one of the things that journalists can do. Journalists can prove in a world of fog, in a world of misinformation, that they're the people to come to. They're the people that can be trusted. The media can be journalists and really good independent media can become the source of trusted information. The issue of pay is a big thing. If you can't afford to pay journalists, journalism is expensive, and if you can't afford to pay journalists, then I'm afraid it can become very, very difficult indeed.
We have a situation where we have a lot of fines, at least here in Nigeria. You're fined for in many cases things you can't control, right? So if someone says something and it's considered against national security, or is considered, and they throw this at us quite a bit. They throw the issue of national security at journalists all the time. Even when we're trying to get information, on pressing issues, they say, in the interest of national security. Could you talk to us a bit about how to navigate that particular nexus? Because, it's something that is still being discussed, but it's not very clear on how you can draw that line between proper journalism and ensuring that national security is not compromised.
Well, what is national security? Is national security a matter of things that are going to protect the state, things that are going to protect the nation? Or is national security a mechanism for protecting politicians? I think it's mainly used as a mechanism for protecting politicians. Many years ago, I worked for the BBC, and we used to come across quite often the government would try and use it used to be called a D notice, which is a defence notice, and that was a notice which was very rarely used. Where you would name, say, for instance, a member of the Special Forces, or you would talk about a military operation. But those were cases of national security. If you're talking about unearthing acts of terrorism, that is a mechanism, a means of national security. But exposing wrongdoing amongst politicians is exactly what you should be doing. That's not an issue of national security. I'd be really intrigued to hear what sort of things are considered national security.
Many journalists, at least heads of journalist organizations in Nigeria, are asking for co-regulation of the media space. So basically what we have here, and I don't know if that's the same case in the UK, is where a government body sits, watches broadcasts, determines what is right and what is wrong, and then places penalties. And media organizations are saying, no, that's not how this should be done. We should be a part of this co-regulation. Is that something that you agree to, some kind of co-regulation of the space?
Look at the broadcast media within the UK. Broadcast media within the UK are still exposing wrongdoing. Every single day they're exposing wrongdoing. The government hate the broadcast media in the UK. If you look at the government hate the BBC because they're constantly questioning them. The government hate Channel 4. They're constantly questioning them and challenging them. So I don't think it stops broadcasters doing what they're good at, doing what they should be doing.
Just do it within the laws. Try to stay within
the laws, and that's a responsible way of doing it.
My final question really has to do with litigation. I spoke with a print journalist, and I really wanted to get your thoughts on this. Someone said libel should be a civil matter, not a criminal matter.
This is a very dirty tactic that a lot of very powerful people are constantly doing. What they're doing is they're picking up and they're looking at cases, and they're saying, well, if we don't like that, then we'll go down the libel route. Now, a lot of journalists can't afford to protect themselves. They can't afford to fight that sort of litigation in courts. And so quite often the guys get away with it. And I think that's a very dangerous situation. I think there needs to be a root and branch, complete look at the libel laws in the UK, and they need to be completely redressed.
And we hope those same laws are looked at in Nigeria. Well, that's all the time that we have for today's interview. But I want to thank you so much, Mr. David Hayward, for being with us on the program. And good luck. I know you have a lot of work ahead of you. Good luck with what you have ahead of you.
Great. Well, it's really good to speak to you. And I'll see you again soon.
Thanks to Mr. David Hayward and everyone who spoke to us today on the program. There are so many quotes on the need for press freedom and the link between the freedom of the press and the rights of everyone in the society. But the truth is, many governments and corporate institutions are afraid of a truly free press, especially in climes like Nigeria, where impunity allows corruption thrive, where people adorn themselves in religious garments and commit their atrocities brazenly, knowing they will not be called to account, knowing that force or money will shut up the mouths of many in this climb. No one looks good under a microscope, but if you have stayed above board, you will not fear intense scrutiny. So the truth is, the call for a truly free press necessitates a call for a society led by conscience. And if we are not ready as a people to live and act above board, whether in government or in private institutions, the calls for a free press have fallen on deaf ears. That's Dateline Abuja this week. Please let us know the happenings in your neighborhood using the social media handle showing right now on your screen. Thank you so much for watching. I am Kayla Megwa. See you next time.